We do not train to be merciful here. Mercy is for the weak. Here in the streets, in competition, a man confronts you, he is the enemy. An enemy deserves no mercy. There might be one or two of you in here that know where that comes from. Anybody? Yeah, Cooper, where is it? It is from Karate Kid. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I referenced a movie entitled Karate Kid 2, and we talked about in that movie, the theme was all for the glory of love, and we discussed how it's really all for the glory of God. This morning, as I looked at the topic of mercy, I couldn't help but be drawn back to the first Karate Kid movie. Because in the first Karate Kid movie, there's two instructors. John Creasy, who is the guy who makes this quote, and he manages or teaches at the Cobra Kai dojo. And then there's Mr. Miyagi, who is just a simple man from Korea who takes on one student and teaches him to defend himself. The whole movie is about this conflict that exists between their two styles, if you will, of karate. What karate's about, what it's for, what its purposes are. John Creasy believes that life is a battle. He's a Vietnam veteran, and that very much plays into his philosophy on what karate is and about how everyone who confronts you is your enemy, and that enemy deserves no mercy. Where on the flip side, you have Mr. Miyagi, who views karate and martial arts as something of a heritage and a legacy, and it's about honor and about self-discipline and about sort of passive, it's not aggressive. And so the whole movie is about this conflict that exists, and you see that conflict between the two teachers playing out between their students as they are constantly in a fight with one another. And every time they encounter is Johnny, John's student, and Daniel, Mr. Miyagi's student. Every time they encounter each other, it's always about not just getting even, but getting ahead. Isn't that the story of our humanness? Isn't that something that is sort of buried within each one of us? This desire to get ahead, not just get even, but to get ahead. Maybe this will help you recognize that it really does sort of exist within us. Have you ever been in a prank war with someone? Good old-fashioned pranks, just fun? It's never just getting even, is it? Somebody pranks you, and ha ha, joke's on me, but guess, right? And so we play a prank back, and we're trying to do equal or more to them. I remember in high school, I got into a prank war with a friend of mine. It was a childhood friend. Her name was Brooke. And Brooke and I got into this prank war. I don't remember who started it. Probably me, but maybe not. And it was pranking each other's cars, like shoe polishing the car. I think that's where it started. And it was shoe polish the car. And so the next thing was, well, I can't just shoe polish. That's already been done. Right? That would just be getting even. We don't get even, we get ahead. And so we had this exchange until, yes, I won, but I'm really not proud of it. Right? Don't get in a prank war with a girl, guys. Because even though you might win, it came at the cost of her being in tears. That was my good friend, right? And that wasn't the intent, but in my efforts to one up, to get ahead, I brought hurt. It exists within us. Probably because culturally, that's really globally, that's what's in us as human beings. When somebody gets me, the inner uncontrollable desire is to get them back. But to get them back better. or worse, or in a more painful or meaningful way. Jesus had some words to speak in regard to this type of living. In Matthew chapter 5, if you've got your Bibles, I would encourage you to open up there. But in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verses 38, it won't be an unfamiliar passage to you, but let's look at it for just a minute. Matthew records the words of Jesus as this: "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." So there was this Old Testament law, and there was this kind of way of living that said if someone wronged me, I had every right to wrong them back in equal value. So, for instance, I heard somebody, Randy Harris, in a book that he writes, uses this illustration. If somebody slams my finger in the door of the car, I have every right to slam their finger in the door, but not their head. Right? An eye for an eye. It's payback for what was done to me. There was this general rule of living, so to speak, an eye for an eye. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, don't stand up against an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. Now I pause to make sure we understand that we're not necessarily, I don't believe Jesus was necessarily talking about a fist fight. It might apply, but what Jesus was talking about, a slap to the cheek, as an insult. It was a sign of insult. So if somebody insults you, you respond with, "That's all you got?" You turn to them the other one, the other cheek, allowing them to insult you again. If someone let me back up. If someone wants to sue you, verse 40, in court, and take your shirt, let them have your coat also. If someone forces you to go with him 1 mile, go with him 2. If a person asks you for something, give it to him. Don't refuse. Give to someone who wants to borrow from you. I want to pause and remind us of a couple of things taking place there. Perhaps you are aware, or maybe you're not, that in the times that Jesus is speaking, the Jewish people were under Roman rule. And a written law was that a Roman soldier could force you to carry his pack for 1 mile. And you had no choice. It was law. And if he said to you, "Here, carry my pack," you had to carry it for 1 mile. You had to stop what you were doing. Nothing was more important in that moment. And you carried the pack. And Jesus took this thing that Jewish people would have very much hated. This law that they would have very much despised. And he said, you don't just do that. You do more. You don't just go 1 mile begrudgingly and grumpily. That's what I would have done. Right? But you go 2 miles with joy. With escalation. That you were able to carry someone else's load. If someone wants to borrow, just give it to them. I laugh because I have my younger brother with me this morning. And we were talking about how, as a child, we were talking about one instance in particular, but it would be applicable to everything as brothers. He's the twin to Kevin. This is Carrie. He's the twin to Kevin. They would ask to borrow my things all the time. And my answer would be unequivocally no. And so they would just take it when I wasn't looking. Right? That's what we do. But Jesus says when someone asks to borrow, you just give it. It goes against the very being of who we are, right? Especially as brothers. That's mine, you can't have it. But Jesus puts into place this new ethic, if you will, that says if someone asks, you give. If you owe one thing, do more. If it's right to do this, do extra. Go the extra mile. And then he continues. As if that wasn't enough, he continues. You have heard, verse 43, that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who hurt you. If you do this, you will be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on good people and on evil people. He sends rain to those who do right and those who do wrong. If you love only the people who love you, you will get no reward. Even the tax collectors do that. And if you are nice only to your friends, you are no better than other people. Even those who don't know God are nice to their friends. So you must be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. This second little section that we've read together this morning is actually, to me, a whole lot more difficult than the first. I finally grew out of just immediately saying no when asked. It's easier when someone asks to borrow to give them what they want, and more, perhaps. It's become a little bit easier to go the extra mile, if you will, with joy. Not always. Sometimes I still grumble and complain, right? But it's become a whole lot easier to practice what Jesus would call us to in that first little section, but this next one, it becomes a lot harder. In the context of loving our neighbor, that's what we've been talking about for a while. Loving our neighbor. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, but I tell you, love your enemies. And the summation of this passage is because everybody loves their neighbor. Everybody, when neighbor is defined by those who love you. Everybody loves their friends. That's not a uniquely Christian characteristic, is it? On the drive to worship this morning, the radio was on and 2 songs played back to back on the country music station. I don't remember which they were, but the meaning of both of them was very simply, love your neighbor. The whole world buys that. Everybody wants that. We just want to get along, don't we? We're all screaming for that. Now, we're not doing a very good job of it, but we're all screaming for let's just get along, and it doesn't require you to be a Christian to get along with people, especially your friends. That's what friends are about, aren't they? I gravitate to the people that are like me. I gravitate to the people that share the same interests. I call people a friend if they're easy to get along with. If they're not, then what do? They're not my friend, and I don't hang out with them. Because I don't care about them. I don't want to spend time with them. Quite frankly, as Jesus would be discussing here, I just don't love them. But Jesus says, those people, love them. That's what makes you uniquely Christian. That's what makes you uniquely a disciple of Jesus Christ. That's what sets us apart. Remember, you are my disciples if you love one another. That's how people know. That's what makes us different. If we love the people, not just our friends and family, but Jesus would call them our enemies. Now, I don't know, again, Randy Harris in his book indicates that, or reminds us that while Jesus might be talking about enemies here, our tendency might be to flash forward or flash our minds to a place like the Middle East, and those are our enemies because they're different to us, right? Their religious beliefs are different, and they're fighting against our country. Therefore, they are our enemies. But maybe individually, we don't have a whole lot of enemies. Maybe you don't. But let me ask you this. Do you have a lot of irritants, as he would call them? People that irritate you? He tells a story of a student. I'm not going to tell it because it's not mine to tell, but there are irritants in our life, right? There are people that just bring out the irritation in us, and he would broaden our thoughts, our ideas, and our understanding of enemy to one who is opposed against us. And wouldn't someone who's an irritant, who irritates me all the time, wouldn't they be opposed to me? Or I would certainly see them that way. And I would have the want and the desire to dismiss them or get rid of them or to remove them from my life. But Jesus says, no, don't hate your enemies and love your friends. He says, love your enemies. Even those people that just irritate you. They're not evil. They just bother you. They get on your nerves. They frustrate you. Because loving the people who love you, everybody can do. That's not uniquely Christian. What's uniquely Christian is loving those who don't love you. What's he talking about in these passages that we've read? It's really just one word. It's mercy. As I read that first section in particular, but then also this dealing with enemies, it's mercy. You know what mercy means? I got to warn you, I'm challenged with the English language because in this definition there's going to be another word that I'm not sure I understand. And had to look that one up as well, right? But here in the dictionary, mercy is defined as compassion or forbearance. That's the word that I'm like, what's that? Compassion or forbearance shown towards someone whom it is within one's power to punish or harm. In other words, it's within my power to punish and harm Phil, but I'm going to show mercy, compassion, or forbearance. And so what is that word forbearance? A refraining from, withholding from, or keeping from the enforcement of something that is due, such as a debt, a right, or an obligation. So the Roman soldier in Jesus' story would have said, I can make you go 1 mile, but I won't. Might be considered mercy. Or as Jesus called the Christian, the follower of his, to, I can make you go 1 mile, yeah, but I can choose to go 2. That's mercy. It's my right to only go 1. The law only requires that of me. But my mercy, my compassion and forbearance for you is to go 2 because I can. Just as our neighbor is defined by the one who is next to us, so our enemy can be defined as one who is opposed to us or who is indifferent to us. It broadens the perception. It alleviates the ability for us to view each other, even at times, as enemy to one another. Or to view our next door neighbor who we're in conflict with. I remember a family who shared a driveway. There was a singular drive up to the house, and then it split off at the house into this one and to that one. And there was a constant fight and bickering over that driveway and who owned the drive up. One neighbor was even so much almost as to get the measuring tape out to decide where the dividing line was, and if you were an inch over, he would not hesitate to call the police for trespassing on his property. The family that I knew that shared that driveway was merciful and did everything they could beyond all reason to ensure that they did not offend the neighbor with which they shared a driveway. He was their enemy, not in the sense of guns and knives and wars and fists, but in the sense of opposed to them. And Jesus in Luke, when he speaks of our enemies, I don't think he means for us to think only of those that are far away, those opposed to our country or to our government or to our beliefs in God, but also to recognize that he's talking about anyone that's outside of our tribe, our friends, and our family. Our tribe are those people that love us, the ones that are easy to love, right? Because they love me, so I can love them. It's that easy. That's our tribe. Jesus would say your enemy can include anyone outside of that tribe. The ones that are harder to love. The ones who don't love you. In Luke chapter 10, he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. Most of you know that story, I'm sure, that parable. He tells it because someone comes asking, a teacher of the law comes asking, who is my neighbor? It's a fair question, right? That may be one that we ask on a regular basis, because if I'm supposed to love my neighbor, it's certainly one we should be asking. If I'm supposed to love my neighbor, shouldn't I know what that means? Or who my neighbor is? And so in response to that question, Jesus tells that parable of the Good Samaritan. The short version is there's a priest and a Levite. It almost starts to sound like a joke, but there's a priest and a Levite and a Samaritan. And they all are walking down the same road at different times, and they all pass the same man. A man who has been beaten, who has been robbed, who has been left for dead. The priest, focusing on his priestly duties, passes by on the other side. The Levite, focused on his responsibilities to remain clean and to be able to serve within the temple, passes by on the other side. And the Samaritan, who understand that in the audience before Jesus at this moment is the villain in the story. The Samaritan is the villain because the Samaritans are considered half-breeds. They are the result of when Israel went into Assyrian captivity. The Israelite captives married to the Assyrians, and they had children, and those children became the Samaritans. And so to the Israelites, to the Jews, the Samaritans were impure, unworthy, and they became the brunt of much social, racial injustice. And so here we are, the Samaritan, the villain of the story, and Jesus says, but it was the Samaritan who stopped. And understand that most likely the wounded person in the story, probably understood to be a Jew by those who receiving it, he would have felt the same way about the Samaritan as the people listening. And the Samaritan stops, he gives aid, he carries him to the next town, he puts him up, he pays his bill in advance and says, and I'll come back and pay whatever else is due, whatever was required to get him well. And so as Jesus finishes the story, he asks the lawyer, he asks the teacher of the law, who was the neighbor? And I love it because he's not able to say, the way I would answer it, there was a priest, there was a Levite, and there was a Samaritan. Who was the neighbor? The Samaritan. The teacher of the law, being a wordsmith of sorts, if you will, I'm led to believe couldn't bring his self to say Samaritan, but his response is so much more powerful, isn't it? He says the one who was the neighbor was the one who showed mercy. The one who showed mercy. So in an attempt to maybe avoid saying a word, he gives the most powerful definition of what it means to be a neighbor. To be someone who is merciful. One who is full of mercy and shares and shows that mercy to all who are next to you, whether they are part of your tribe or not, whether they are considered a family, friend, or enemy. the one next to you is your neighbor first. And being a good neighbor isn't State Farm insurance. It's showing mercy. Jesus calls for us to let go of ourselves, and in particular our need to get even or ahead, and he instead invites us to a new ethic of pursuing others' needs above our own, even when it costs us something, like the Samaritan. When it costs us putting aside our pride and helping one who doesn't love me but is out to hurt me. When it costs me turning the other cheek in order that the insult can come again. When it costs me not just the cloak that they're suing me for, but all of the clothes that are on my back. It's pursuing others' needs above our own, even when it costs us something. Or maybe simply put, being merciful. Do you remember what he said at the beginning of that Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5? Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. As followers of Jesus, loving our neighbor is not just a good idea, but it's half of our core relationship with God. Remember? All the law and the prophets hang on these two things. Which ones? Loving God and loving our neighbors. It's half of the core of our relationship with God. Things are beginning to get a little bit messy as we look at our calling to love our neighbors. Messy because what Jesus wants for me is in complete contradiction for what I want for myself. It becomes messy because it's a battle against what Jesus has called me to is an inner battle against myself. Because what I want is very much different than what Jesus wants of me. And so in order to be a follower of his, I have to let go of me and be led by his Spirit. It's a constant battle to surrender to the Spirit rather than to myself. And where there is a battle, there's always a mess, isn't there? If you don't believe me, go watch a few of Hollywood's renditions of the war movies, right? We were flipping through the channels yesterday and Saving Private Ryan was on. A story about World War II. And it was messy. Village in England was the scene. Buildings were demolished. Bodies were laying dead in the streets. There was nothing redemptive about that picture. Where there's a battle, it's always messy. And when it comes to following Jesus, there is a battle. When it comes to loving our neighbor, there is a battle that's raging inside of each of us. Because it's what I want for me versus what Jesus wants for me. May we choose to be a people of mercy, a people who turn the other cheek, who go the extra mile, who look out for the needs of all our neighbors, even when it costs